Morning. If you're new here, my name is Jim. I'm the lead pastor here. So glad you are joining us online and here this morning just to worship together. We kicked off the series a couple weeks ago called Back to School, and just watching that video just kind of makes me cringe, remembering back all the crazy days. I just can't imagine being in school this year. No kid's happy to have to wear a mask through school, let alone an adult, right, through work and all that stuff. What a crazy year and a lot of circumstances we have to deal with. Well, I just want to make sure everybody's awake as we're getting started this morning. So we're just I want to everybody just take a moment, just kind of stretch your arms out. Try not to hit the person next to you too hard, all right? Just kind of stretch a little bit. All right, now I want you to really elbow that person next to you. Man, you guys are terrible. Some of you are I know, was anybody doing it at home? Anybody watching somebody's house right now? Now, see, today we're actually talking about peer pressure. See, you guys fell right into this whole thing. I kind of set you up, didn't I? Now, how many of you guys remember the whole thing of peer pressure growing up? Today we're going to be talking about just positive peer pressure, but just going to be talking about just peer pressure because I tell you, it is easy to be influenced, right? And I just can't imagine, kids today in school, there's so many voices speaking into, we're going to talk about this in this series, just how many voices that our, young people today and people just in general have speaking into our lives more so than ever in history with the information age and all the technology that we have. But just, peer pressure is just easy to kind of be influenced. And so, I just want to just kind of take a moment, just ask some questions as we start off here. If you had the opportunity to go back in time and go back to school, those of you that are older aren't in school, would you change anything? Would you approach school much differently the second time around than some of you that played around while, instead of, would you just kind of approach it a whole lot differently? Okay, another question I would ask is, would you hang out with a different group of kids that you hung out with in school? Some of you are like, no way, I'm going to still hang out with those rough, wild, crazy people. All right, would you go back? Would you change anything about all that? Now let me ask you another question. If you could see into the future, would you change who you're hanging out with now? Would you change things about your life now if you could see into the future and know the impact that what you're doing now will have in the future? Would you change any of those things? The question I really want us to kind of look at today as we're looking at this topic of positive peer pressure is just answering this question, who do you want to be? Now, when you're a kid, I just remember looking back, I shared this a little bit last week. As a kid, it's like I had no idea who I wanted to be, right? And so it's easy when you're young to be vulnerable to a lot of voices, right? And a lot of people just kind of speaking into your life, and kids, they're either in your neighborhood or kids at school that could have just this influence, right, on our lives. And so I just have a couple quotes from some pastors that I wanted to kind of put up here. You've heard me share a couple of these before. The first one's from Pastor Andy Stanley, and he says this. He says, "Your friends will always determine the quality and direction of your life." Your friends will always determine the quality and direction of your life. Now, I just remember as I was prepping this week, I was thinking back of some of the friends that I hung out with that influenced me at different times. All right, another pastor, Pastor Craig Rochelle, you've heard me quote him before. He says, "Show me your friends and I'll show you your future." All right? Show me your friends and I'll show you your future. All right, let me give you a third one. This is from John Maxwell, former pastor, now is a leadership guru. And he says it this way: the people around you will determine the level of your success. So it's important when it comes to peer pressure, it's important that we have positive peer pressure because the people that we let into our lives, the people that we let into our kids' lives, can have a significant impact on your life. This is how the Bible puts it in book of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20. It says this, walk with the wise and what? Become. See, there's an action thing. There's a transition thing that can happen. If you walk with the wise, the whole book of Proverbs is just about wisdom. It's the mind of God. It's embracing the mind of God throughout every area of our life. And so it says, walk with the wise and you'll become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm, right? The people around you will impact your future. Let me put it in my own little kind of bullet point here. Basically, the scriptures tells us this: the people that you surround yourself with will have an impact on your life, either good or bad, right? So it's important that we choose wisely, because there's always going to be peer pressure. There's always going to be people around us that are going to influence us in one way or another, whether good or bad. Now, I just remember, going back to, middle school and high school. I went to a creative arts school. Many of you know I shared a little bit about that last week. And while I was in this creative arts school, you can hold off on that when you go back slide. I'll get to that here in a second. Sorry. Throwing you guys off. When I was at this creative arts school, all right, this kind of a picture, we would often have these productions, all right, and so I played in the pit band, and sometimes I was actually in the production. Well, after school, while they were running a rehearsal on one segment, and they gave the pit orchestra a break, we just kind of wandered the halls, right? And you just go around and you find doors that were unlocked, right? How many of you ever did this? Come on, I know I'm not the only sinner in this room, right? All right. So we walk around, and I told you a story last week about Furman Whitmer. Was it last week before? This teacher that just called all of us, average students, that made just life impossible. Well, we were just kind of wandering through the halls one day. My brother was with me. My parents were watching online. I don't even know we did these things, So they're finding out for the first time. So we were wandering the hallways. We're finding doors that were unlocked, and we found that Furman Whitmer's classroom door was unlocked. So we went in. And we were having, I wasn't taking his class yet, but my brother was. There was a group of us we were hanging out with. And so they decided to start going through his files to find the book with all the tests, the answer keys, right? How convenient, all right? And of course I didn't take it or do anything with it, so moving on, just kidding. So they actually grabbed it and they took it, all right? And I wasn't taking the class, so I didn't have any skin in the game. I really didn't care. But then when I had it next year, it was like, hey, John, my brother, I was like, you still got that book you got from Furman Whitmer's? It's like, I need it desperately, because this guy's killing me. He's killing all of us. So what do? We went in there and they took that, but then that next year when it was my turn, I had the answer to every test. And it fit perfectly in my workbook. Right? And so the thing, I'm kind of confessing my sins today. But because I was hanging around this group of kids, and we were just kind of wandering the halls, we found that we had all the answers, and this teacher made it so impossible that we were going to try to cheat so that we could get ahead, because this teacher was not helping us at all. He was actually treating us very unfairly, because we were all doing well. So we wanted to make sure that we got a good score on every test. Now, obviously, I didn't get every answer right purposely. So you got to know these tricks, right? You got to know the ones to actually look like you had to do all the work. So you just couldn't get away with putting the answer down. You had to show your work, all right? So I'm confessing my sin here. But after school, we're hanging out with these guys, and then another time we found out the home ec room was open. And there was a refrigerator, and in the refrigerator were some eggs. And we were on the 5th floor. And so they conveniently found themselves up against the windows of the apartments across the street. I don't know how they got there, but somehow they did. Now I'm sure some of you probably did worse things than that. I didn't do anything. But we all probably did things because of peer pressure, right? Because it was like, oh, come on, it won't hurt anything. Let's just go and do this, right? And so we did crazy things because other people influenced us to do things that, looking back, those other things we probably did, wishing that I could go back and change that and do something different. Well, we can put that picture back up here. One of my best friends, Lewis, who was my very best friend, the black guy sitting here, we played our horns together. That's me sitting next to him. Let's all go, aw. That's why my hair wasn't gray, even though it looks that way because it's a black and white picture. Because we didn't have color back then for our yearbook. That's from our yearbook, because that's how old I am now. Actually, they decided to do black and white because those were our school colors, all right? So my best friend Lewis, he and I, we just held each other accountable, even though we never really talked about our faith much. The cool thing is that today in Texas, he is actually being ordained as a deacon in his church. It's a really good-sized church. He's actually isn't that pretty cool? And so I'm going to go on and watch that later this afternoon. But Lewis here, he and I were like brothers. We were inseparable. And we kind of had this thing where, because we understood peer pressure, that we wanted to be our own peer pressure with each other and just challenge each other to do the right thing. And so one of the things we would often do, we gave each other permission to do, is if one of us saw the other person doing something really stupid, we gave each other permission to punch each other in the shoulder as hard as we could, right? And if you ever have a friend like that, the girls are like, yeah. Come on, girls. Some of you had somebody who did something, right? But the guys, we punched each other. It's like, that was just stupid. If I came up with excuses or whatever, we just were always trying to keep each other accountable to do the right thing because peer pressure is important. And it's important to know who our kids are hanging out with. Right? It's important to know who we're hanging out with because the people around us can desperately influence us. So I remember also when I was younger, when I was about in middle school, there were some kids in our neighborhood, and we'll get to some Bible text here in a minute, just telling some stories. Just the influence of other people around us, as that proverb says. All right, I was in middle school, neighbor kid. We were a handful of us in the neighborhood were hanging out together one day. Neighbor kid's parents smoked, and he stole a pack of cigarettes from his parents, and we got on our bikes, and we rode, really far away. We're several miles. That was back when you didn't have to worry about where your kids went, right? And we were several miles away on our bikes, riding, and then we all huddled together facing each other on our bikes in a circle. A neighbor kid reached in his pocket, pulled out the pack of cigarettes, passed one out to every one of us. We'd never smoked before. It was like, we get to do an adult thing, right? And so we all got the cigarettes out. We put them in our mouth. We're getting ready to light them. And all of a sudden, we hear this old man screaming from his front porch, "Hey, you kids, you put those things away right now. Don't you like those things?" Just yelling from his front porch. We didn't know this guy from anybody. Man, you never see a bunch of kids scramble so fast and get out of there. Threw him down and took off. And I just remember that day thinking, there is always somebody watching. And I promise you, I never touched a cigarette or came close to anything ever again. And I tell you what, I'm so thankful for that old guy out on his front porch watching kids and yelling at me, my brother, and several of us friends who were sitting there, because I'll tell you what, it was a game changer. It changed everything, all because that one person was willing to speak up and call us out. How important it is to have someone watching and someone speaking into our lives when we're ready to do something stupid, right? So peer pressure is a real thing. It's an important thing. And I just want to say this because in light of this guy and this friend I had in my life, you might be one friend away from changing the course of your life. You might be one friend away, having one person in your life from changing the course of your life, whether good or bad, right? Now, I'm talking about positive things. I'm talking about for the good. You might be that one friend in somebody else's life to speak into their life that needs that wise person come alongside them to help change the course and direction of their future. Because the people that we surround ourselves with will have an impact on our life. We need people in our lives to speak into our lives, to pressure us, to challenge us, to hold us accountable, to live out our faith that we're called to in Christ, right? And so I'm so thankful for that old guy sitting on his front porch. I'm so thankful for my friend Lewis that always held me accountable for the dumb things that I would say and the dumb things that I would do, except for that when we cheated on our tests. He went along with that with me. Desperate situations call for desperate times, right? But it's so important that we surround ourselves. So I'm going to look at a couple people today. One, we're going to start off in the New Testament, and we're looking at a guy who becomes the Apostle Paul, but originally he was known as Saul of Tarsus, all right? And Saul of Tarsus, kind of a good way just to think about Saul is that he was kind of like the bully in your neighborhood. That one kid that was always causing trouble for everybody else, right? Anybody ever have one of those people in your neighborhood? I mean, we had several in our neighborhood growing up. There was always this one. So think of Saul of Tarsus as kind of the bully. He did not believe that the Christian faith was right. Now, he had godly character being a Jew, but he was out to see the Christians were arrested and that they were beaten and that they were executed. And then one day, Jesus appears to Saul, who later becomes the Apostle Paul. When he was on his way, he got letters from the Jewish leadership to go to Damascus and have Christians arrested, then executed. And as he's on this road to Damascus, Jesus appears to him and reveals to him that he is the Messiah. And he has this radical conversion. All right? Now I want you to think about this context. All right, if there was a well-known person going around today burning churches and killing Christians, and then he happened just to walk into our church one Sunday morning, what would you think? You'd be thinking the worst, right? You'd be thinking the worst. And then he says, "No, I'm a Christian now." Yeah, right. We saw what you just did yesterday, right? It'd be really hard to let him into your fellowship. So I want to look at Acts chapter 9 because this is what's going on. He becomes a believer. But now he's got to try to convince everybody else, right? Because there's always consequences to our actions. So this is what happens in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 9, starting in verse 26. It says, when Saul came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him. You better believe they were. It's like, we know this guy. He's been out getting these Christians arrested and beaten and executed. How he's playing his game. There's no way he's a believer. And it says, not believing that he really was a disciple. They weren't convinced. No way. We're not letting this guy in our church. No way. We know his reputation. Right? Think back to those people, maybe some of those people that were in your school or in your neighborhood. Those ones that were going around always causing trouble. There's no way that guy came to Christ. No way. Right? But yet we probably know some. Right? So here Saul, he's trying to live out his faith, but he can't because the church doesn't believe that he's really a believer. But there was one guy that changed the course of his life. That changed really the course, the impact on our life today, because he was willing to stick out his neck and his reputation, believing that Saul really became a person of faith. It goes on, verse 27, and says these two powerful words, but Barnabas. But Barnabas. Now think about it in the context of yourself today. If you put your name in there, right? But Jim, but Tyler, but Roger, but Mike, but Brian, whoever, right? Your name, you insert your name in there. Whose life are you impacting? Here's this one guy, Barnabas. It says, but Barnabas, he took him and brought him to the apostles, and he told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord, and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. Now, that couldn't have been easy for Barnabas. He's like risking his reputation. He's like, guys, I saw him preaching the name of Jesus. This is not a show. He is the real deal. I believe in him. I believe his story. Jesus appeared to him. He is a changed man. Now, think about the influence that Barnabas had on his life. It goes on in verse 28. It says, so Saul, he got to stay with them. He stayed with them and moved about freely in Jerusalem, doing what? Speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. Now, if Barnabas would have never been bold enough to stick his reputation on the line for Saul, Saul's life and the trajectory of his ministry would have been very different. A guy who planted more churches than any other apostle. A guy who gives us most of the New Testament letters. Right? Think about the impact of one person in your life. You could be that person impacting somebody else's life. You might need a Barnabas in your life to impact you in the course and direction of your life and your future. Your kids need these kinds of friends in their lives that will impact the course and direction of their lives. So what I want to do is we're just looking at this thing called positive peer pressure. I just want to look at 3 kinds of friends that you need in your life. And not only do you need them in your life, but your kids need these kinds of friends in your life. We're going to look at another guy. We're going to look at a guy by the name of David, who was about 1,000 years or so earlier, became the great king, the great psalm writer. You know, a guy who made a lot of mistakes. But God in his word says that he was a man after his own heart. After every time that David messed up, he would always repent and turn his heart towards God to do the right things. But David had some key people in his life. And the first person I want to point out, number 1 here, is the kind of friends you need to have. We all need a Samuel. Now, Samuel wasn't so much like a friend. Samuel was a prophet. He was a prophet of God at the time. Samuel was the one that anointed the first king of Israel, King Saul. Very different Saul from Saul of Tarsus. All right? Saul of Tarsus became Paul, the Apostle Paul. This is way before that. This is when the whole kingdom, the dynastic period in the Old Testament, the kingdom of Israel actually becomes a kingdom. And Samuel was the prophet of God who anointed Saul to be the first king of Israel. And you know what? Saul started really well. He started well, but he did not end well. Because he surrounded himself with the wrong people and he listened to the wrong voices and his heart began to drift. And he started doing things that he knew that he shouldn't do. He took matters into his own hands many times. And God rejects him as being king. And so now God's looking for a new king. And he goes to Samuel. He says, Samuel, he says, hey, I want you to go to this guy named, the house of Jesse, a guy named Jesse, the house of Jesse, and you're going to find the next person's going to be the next king of Israel. And so the thing about Samuel is we need a friend who sees your God potential. That you're not just, stuck in your mistakes, but someone that sees your God potential is going to come and speak into your life. Every time that Samuel tried to speak into Saul's life, Saul did not obey. He just continued to drift. All right, so Samuel shows up to this house of Jesse, which is David's dad's name is Jesse, and there's all these guys, and one of them was just this big burly guy, and that's kind of how Saul was, big, tall, burly guy, kind of like me, right? Just kidding. Just want to see if you're still awake. All right, this is a big burly guy, and Samuel looks at him and says, "This has got to be the one. This has got to be the next king of Israel because he looks like a king. He looks like he's got the stature." He's got the looks. He's got to be the next king of Israel. But this is what happens in 1 Samuel chapter 16, starting in verse 7. It says, "But the Lord said to Samuel," he says, "do not consider," he's looking at this one son of Jesse, "do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." And so in this moment, Samuel's like, okay, so who else? There's no one else here. If this isn't the one, who is the one? I mean, it's like, size this guy up. This looks like the right, look at Saul. So you picked the first time, God. So I was thinking this is what I say, no, I don't look at what's on the outside because we see how quickly what's on the outside just rots away, right? It's what's going on the inside. And so Samuel's like, "Is there another son here?" It's like, "Yeah, the youngest, this little runt boy. He's out in the fields taking care of the sheep." And that's kind of how they were looking at David. He's just this little guy. And the way that the scriptures kind of talk about David is that he kind of either had red hair or he had reddish skin. All right, he was good looking, but he just kind of stood out a little bit, like reddish hair, or red skin. And so anyway, so they bring this little runt guy, the youngest. He wasn't tall, and because we know that he wasn't a big guy because when he tried to put on King Saul's armor to go out and fight Goliath, right, it was so big he couldn't move in it. So he wasn't a really big guy. And so this little guy comes up, and then this is what it goes on in verse 12. It says, "Then the Lord said, 'Rise and anoint him. This is the one.'" Verse 13, "So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David." Now I can guarantee you in that moment, David's brothers, because we see their interaction later on as David goes up to the front lines during the time of Goliath when he was taunting the Israelite army. They're sitting there looking at this guy like, "Seriously? You're anointing this little runt to be the next king of Israel?" There's no way. There's nothing about him that's kingly. He's just a little shepherd boy. He doesn't belong leading people, right? But when you have a Samuel in your life, someone that sees your God potential, someone that listens to the voice of God, that's willing to speak into your life and say, "I know that you are going to amount to something great. You are now anointed to be the next king of Israel." Could you imagine the influence and the impact on your life to have someone to speak into your life with such powerful words? It'll change your future. And you could be that friend, or you may need a friend like that could speak into your life. Your kids need friends like that to speak into their life. And I could just imagine the brothers, when David went up to the front lines to bring them supplies, they're like, "What are you doing here, you little runt? Go back home. Go take care of the sheep. I know what you're doing. You're just playing games. You're just up here just to kind of nosy around and be nosy and see what's going on here." And his brothers were just like making fun of him. He's like, "Look, I just came to bring you supplies." But that's when David sees this giant, right, taunting the armies of the living God, and then decides to go out and tackle this guy. We all need a friend in our life that can see us better than we are, that can speak into our lives and encourage us to be better than we are, to see the God potential that's in our lives. It was interesting that a couple weeks ago, I got to Facebook message a kid that I have not seen since high school. He was younger, a lot younger, several years younger than I was. And he's a Jewish kid, very talented kid, he's a Jewish kid. All right, so, and he's got a perfect Jewish name. His name is Noah Bless. All right, isn't that a perfect Jewish name? Now, this kid was really talented. I remember when Lewis and I, that picture that was up there earlier, when we were in high school, we were the only two trombone players. All the other trombone players quit. So we were the only two trombone players in high school, and we needed some more trombone players for the band and for the jazz band. So our band director, came to us and said, hey, would you guys be up for bringing a middle schooler up to play, a couple of middle schoolers up to play in the band? Would you be willing to help work with them? I'm sitting there thinking, middle schooler? That's way below me. No, not at all. But you know how it is, high schoolers, middle schoolers, See, I went to school where 4th through 12th grade. We were all around each other all the time. Very unique setting, all right? So it was like, sure, bring them up. And one of them was this kid, Noah Blast. He was an 8th grader, and the kid just had this natural talent. He had incredible ear, and I immediately picked up on it, and so I took it under my wings. I pulled him under my wings and started coaching him and met with him sometimes before school, after school, just helping him get better on his horn. What's crazy is that he went on to become a professional jazz trombone player. Isn't that crazy? And I Facebook messaged him because every once in a while I go on YouTube and I listen to some of the albums he's played on, and I instant messaged him and I said, hey, just checking in, see what you're up to. I love listening to some of your music. And he responded back and he said, I think you're the first person to influence me in playing this instrument. And so I just said, I wish I was walking with God during that point in time where I could influence him in a different way. And maybe sometime in the future I will be able to. But I just share that because you never know what one little thing. When I graduated from high school and I went to college, when I came back home, there was a couple people that contacted me. They needed some musicians for a local theater that needed some pit musicians. And so they called me and I said, hey, I'm willing to do it, but you need more. And he said, yes. So I went and called Noah, who was still in high school. And I said, hey, I'm going to get you your first gig. And I got him his first gig playing horn. It was a paid gig playing for this little local theater that was not far from where we lived. And so you never know what one little thing you do, the impact on someone's future that you can have just from being a positive influence in their life. Samuel changed the course and direction of David's life. He saw his God potential. This one that nobody would thought would be the next king of Israel. Samuel obeyed God and anointed him to be the next king. In the book of Proverbs, in 27:17, it says this. It says, as iron sharpens iron, so a friend sharpens a friend. That's the kind of friends we need in our life. You know how you sharpen iron? There's a lot of sparks that fly. Right? It's not easy. A lot of metal rubbing against metal to make it sharper. And we all need those kind of friends in our life. We need positive peer pressure that's going to sharpen us to be better than we are. Second kind of person David had in his life, which was a true, really good friend, a best friend, like Lewis and I were together, and that is Jonathan. We need a friend like Jonathan, a friend who helps you find spiritual strength. Now, the crazy thing is, after David before he was anointed to be the next king of Israel, Saul was still on the throne, and Saul would not relinquish his throne. Right? So as you're reading through, 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, and you read during this time of David and Saul spends, I don't know how many years it is, but he spends all this time chasing after David, trying to kill him. Even when David was in his own household there playing music, he brought him in to play music. One time Saul lost his cool and took a spear and tried to pin David to the wall with a spear. And so then David, he's constantly on the run because Saul is out to kill him. And he has to go into enemy territory at one point in time and act like he's a madman, foaming at the mouth and everything else just to escape Saul, he's the commander of all the armies. Could you imagine having an entire nation chasing you down? And David, he's the one anointed for king, but he's running for his life. And there's this one person, Jonathan, and Jonathan was the next heir to Saul. He was the king's son, the rightful heir when you follow kingdoms and kingship, right? He was the rightful heir. And Saul is just incredibly jealous of David, right? Because all the girls will go around singing this song. How many of you had girls sing a song about you? Anybody have girls sing a song about you? All right? All the girls are singing this song about David. Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Now, guys, wouldn't that make you just feel great if you had all the girls singing about you that way? It's like, man. And Saul's getting jealous. He's like, why is David getting all the attention? So he's just chasing him down. He's after him. And then Jonathan comes on the scene. All right, this is 1 Samuel 23. It says, while David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him what? Find strength in his God. He came to encourage him. In verse 17, he tells him this. He says, don't be afraid. He said, my father. All right? He's speaking against his father. He says, my father, who is the king, he says, my father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel. And I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this. We all need a Jonathan in our life. Because I will say this. One thing we can learn from that whole story, it doesn't matter how spiritually mature you are, how long you've been walking with God, when you're constantly being chased down and you're constantly being beaten down and ridiculed and had hurtful things said to you, it wears on you after a while. And there were several times throughout the course of David's life where I know that he was starting to wear down. And he needed a Jonathan in his life. We all need a Jonathan in our life because I'm telling you that the things in this world can weigh us down. We are all sinful. We are all broken. And we need people in and around us. Our kids need those kind of friends. They need a Jonathan in their life. Because sometimes, just some days are just harder than other days, right? Sometimes things happen that we didn't plan to happen. And we need someone in our life to speak into our life. And as David's just kind of wearing down, Jonathan comes and says, look, I'm here to encourage you. You're going to be the next king of Israel. Don't give in to my father. Don't be afraid of him. Stay true to your faith in God and what God has called you to. Don't lose sight of it. Don't lose your integrity because of my father. What a great friend, willing to go against the king, his own father. And there were times when Jonathan was sitting with his dad, with Saul, and Saul's, his dad's yelling at him. And he even tried to throw a spear at his own son because he was backing David, his best friend. And we all need a Jonathan in our lives, someone to strengthen us when things get very difficult, because there are times when it can get really hard. And there was one point in time when David was running that there was this guy named by the name of Nabal. All right? And this guy was really a jerk. All right? I mean, he kind of describes him that way in the scriptures. I mean, he was just always saying bad things. And when David and his troops were fleeing from Saul, he was saying all kinds of bad things. And so they were worn out, and they were hungry, and they were thirsty. And they went to this village where Nabal lived. He says, look, will you provide us some food and some drink? And Nabal just basically said a bunch of bad things, mouthed off them, said, get out of here. Because you're not for Saul. You're against the king. Get out of here. And so David told his men, he said, when we come back, I'm going to take Nabal out. And you know what happened? There was one person, there was a woman. Nabal's wife, Abigail, chased him down. She went and made all this food and chased after him and said, my Lord, who will be king, don't throw away your integrity on my foolish husband. Don't throw it away on a fool. You will be the next king of Israel. And she fed his troops. We all need those kind of people in our life. Someone that's going to be there to help strengthen us in the Lord. Last thing, number 3, is this. We need a Nathan. A Nathan who is a friend who tells you the truth. Now, as I said earlier, David made a lot of mistakes. And just last week, when we were at our Fight Club meeting, the pastor was actually talking about David, just talking about all the mistakes that David made. And one of the key things that he brought out, which I'd never heard this side of it, I knew it, but it was really interesting, was that, when David, one day, after he becomes the king of Israel, he should have been out at war with his troops, leading his troops in battle. But instead, he just decided, he was having so much success, he decided just to take a day off and let his right-hand guys just go out and do all the work for him. And so he's just kind of lollygagging. Rather than living on mission, he's just kind of just drifting. And so he decides to go hang out on the roof one day. And he looks out and he sees this beautiful woman bathing. And then he goes and tells one of his right-hand guys, he said, hey, go get her and bring her to me so I can spend time with her. And you know what? That guy went and got her. And then, after he spent time with her, she becomes pregnant. Right? So then, he tells his other right-hand guys to go and take her, goes to her husband and says, hey, go and, you go spend some time with your wife. He says, no, why would I do that? When we're at war, why would I go do this? So then he gets another right-hand guy and says, hey, go take Uriah and take him out to the front lines and then pull back so that he's killed. So David commits adultery, and then David commits murder. And everything he tells his right-hand guys to do, they do. Those are not the kind of friends you need in your life. We all need a Nathan. Because then later on, Nathan comes up to David, and he tells him this little story. And it's in 2 Samuel chapter 12. It says, so the Lord sent Nathan the prophet. This isn't in the notes here. You can leave a blank side. So the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to tell David this story. There were two men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but one little lamb he had bought. He raised that little lamb, and it grew up with his children. It ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. One day a guest arrived at the home of the rich man, but instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for his guest. David was furious. And he makes a vow. Any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. And then Nathan says these very words. Put it up here on the screen. Nathan said to David, you are the man. You're the one that did that. You took the man's wife, and then you sent him to be executed. Now, the incredible thing in this story is when you read on, is that David humbles himself before God. I would encourage you to read Psalm 51 this week. And if I start the beginning of it, you will recognize this psalm that David wrote in response to Nathan's rebuke in his life. This is how the psalm starts. Have mercy on me, O God, because of your unfailing love. Right? Remember that psalm? Because of your great compassion, blot out the stain of my sins. David humbled himself and repented before God. Now, every one of us need a Nathan the prophet. We need someone that can call us out when they see that we're doing things that we know are not right. Saying things that we know we shouldn't be saying. Doing things we know that we shouldn't be doing. Because we all do it, right? From time to time. We all need a Nathan. We need that kind of friend who's willing to hold us accountable. Now, if there's one thing I'm thankful for since we started this church, I had other people in my life, one thing I've just been thankful for is that I have some really good, trusted friends around me. And since we started this church, there's been several times where several people that I trust with my life have come up to me and called me out on things, telling me to stay in my lane, stay focused on what I'm doing, not doing their job, not doing their responsibilities, pointed out things that I didn't even know I was doing. And I tell you what, it was, my tendency, the reason, I just start squirming, and I start coming up with all kinds of excuses. And it's like, okay, you're right. You're beautiful. I'm ugly. You're smart. No. But I tell you what, I'm so grateful and thankful for those kind of people in my life. I don't need a bunch of yes people around me. I need people that are willing to point out when I'm not doing what's right. We all need those kind of people. My heart's desire is to live out my calling and to live in a way that just honors God every day of my life. But there's times when it just gets ugly. I'm just not that smart sometimes. And so we all need a Samuel. We all need a Jonathan. We all need a Nathan. Someone that's willing just to point out the things that we're not doing that aren't right. Let me just close with this. In Proverbs 27, verse 5 and 6, here's the kind of person we need. It says, an open rebuke is better than hidden love. Wounds from what? A sincere friend are better than many kisses from an enemy. There's times when we need to hear the truth because it's easy to drift. It's easy to make mistakes. It's easy to do things we know we shouldn't do. And we need to surround ourselves, and we need to help our kids understand these principles so that they've got those kind of kids surrounding them. And they become that kind of kid, that one friend that could change the course and direction of another classmate in school. Whether it's in grade school, whether it's in college, one person came to me and shared the gospel of Jesus Christ. I shared that with you last week. Changed the course and direction and the calling, everything in my life. You're one friend away from changing your future. Be that friend. Amen. Let's pray.